In the North Sea, the crew of the Kinloch Bravo oil rig is getting ready to finally go home after months of hard work. Unfortunately, Magnus, the rig manager, is receiving a call from the company with bad news. The helicopters are diverting to help the North Kill Scour platform with its power failure, so they don't know when they'll be able to pick Magnus' crew up. Magnus wants to ask for more details, but the phone suddenly stops working. Communications start falling all over the building. Kat's call with her wife freezes and Former can't make the main radio work either. Magnus calls for a meeting and announces that they'll have to wait a while to go home. This isn't well received by anyone, especially not by Lars, who keeps asking for proper explanations. Suddenly the power goes out in the whole building and Former discovers all generators are down. The battery backup is holding things up for now and the production module's holding its pressure. But if it spikes, it could kill them. All Former tries to get in contact with the standby vessel, but the radio still isn't working, and the other oil platform near them seems to be having the same trouble. The whole rig begins shaking and the production module is starting to catch on fire, getting out of control. Rose, the company representative, doesn't want to shut it down yet because they'll be way off quota, but Magnus orders is meant to shut down the module anyway for the sake of their lives. At that moment, the whole rig begins shaking again. Everyone stares in shock when they notice a very thick and fast fog enshrouding the entire building. Moments later, Former manages to bring power back, but communications are still off, and there's no way the choppers will come in this weather. Alwyn wonders if they haven't drilled too much and caused a seismic event, but Rose is a scientist and assures him it doesn't work that way. Magnus thinks fixing communications is their priority, so he sends Former and Bess to check on the radio tower. When they make it to the top, Former begins checking the machine, but he loses his temper when Baz accuses him of betraying the team for getting into a relationship with Rose, who is on the company's side and not theirs. Base quickly apologizes, and when Former lets go of him, he moves to pick something up and finds a dead seagull on the floor. Magnus and Mars are waiting at the base of the tower when suddenly they see Base fall. Kat and Rose rush to the scene with a medical kit while Former comes down as well, explaining he doesn't know what happened because bats have been right behind him. Lars doesn't trust his story because he noticed his base's harness was unclipped. Kat takes back to the medical bay and stabilizes him, but there's nothing else she can do without a surgery room. Lars starts losing it because there's no way choppers will come in time. Rose brings Magnus to the computer to show him that the pipelines have no pressure, which means all the rigs in the area are having the same trouble as them. Moments later, Base wakes up and begins having visions of things coming apart under the sea. Lars goes to Magnus' office to blame him for everything, but Magnus ignores the complaints and leaves. This allows Lars to snoop around his desk and found a private memo from the company that makes him furious. He gathers everyone on the halodeck to inform the management has been lying to them from the start. Magnus comes over too and sees Lars has the memo, so he has to confess that the company's junking the whole field and everyone will lose their jobs soon. The conversation suddenly interrupted by something falling on them. It's ash even though they aren't anywhere near a volcano. Bass shows up at the halodeck as well and announces that it's too late. It's already started before passing out. Later, Baz wakes up in the infirmary and explains he doesn't remember the accident or the halodeck at the tower. He saw something in the fog and heard a noise in his head. Base reacts violently when Kat tries to take blood and yells at them for not listening to his warnings because there's a wave coming. After Kat manages to put him to sleep, she explains to Rose that Base's wounds are somehow quickly healing on their own. Once the women are gone, Base reveals he's still awake, and when he checks his injuries, he sees some glowing spores working on closing them. In the rec room, the crew notices some lights by the window. It's the standby vessel, which is trying to communicate but also going in the wrong direction. Alvin sends Like outside to get the Morse message and they discover the vessel's asking for help. Magnus orders Former to sign back to them using the deck lights to find out what they know. Then he goes to see Cook March to ask him to start rationing their food. Lars is starting to go crazy because he was locked up in his room with Easter guarding the door. In the infirmary, Vaz wakes up again to notice most of his injuries are healed. And when he checks his reflection, he begins having a vision of the rig being destroyed. Then he escapes to his room, and while getting dressed, he begins wriggling in pain as his mouth pushes out his gold tooth. Rose gathers some ash to analyze it and orders everyone to stay inside. Former informs her and Magnus that the vessel doesn't have more information than they do. They don't have communications either, so if they wait for morning to come, they won't be able to use the lights to guide them and the boat could crash. If they evacuate, it should be now, but Rose doesn't want it because it could get them in legal trouble for breaking the contract. But Magnus' priority is everyone's safety, and he asks Former to keep up the lights to guide the vessel slowly. Alwyn goes outside to take over Lex's shift and finds Baz drawing weird circles on a window. When he checks on him, Base explains his head is full of noise and that he shouldn't have survived the accident. Something is definitely not normal about this situation. The lights in the room start flickering and Base has another weird vision before running away. Lars starts working on the window and manages to take it off the wall to escape. Lex sneaks into the infirmary to steal the rubbing alcohol to get drunk, then tries to have a shower. At that moment, his body begins hurting all over and his leg throws up blood. The ink of his tattoo starts to come off his skin. By the time Heather finds him, he's already dead. When Kat comes to check on him, she can't tell what killed him. But when Dunland shows up with Boss's tooth, she's sure there's something pushing an organic material out of their bodies. In the control room, Former notices a light on the bridge that doesn't come from the vessel. He and Alvin go outside to check it out, but Lars sees them and turns off his flashlight before they can catch him. He sneaks back inside the building through the door they used and locks it, bumping into Heather on the way. Former, and now when check the rowboats, in case anyone is trying to escape and Former accidentally wounds his hand. At that moment, the ash mysteriously stops falling. Lars goes to the control room and starts signaling SOS with the lights, causing the vessel to come at full speed. Alvin and Former see the message and try to get back inside, but the door's locked. So Alvin goes looking for another entrance while Former keeps on shouting. Heather hears him and brings Magnus to help her open the door. Former tells them about Lars and they rush to stop him, almost starting a fist fight before Magnus asks them to concentrate on sending a message to the vessel to correct its course. Alwyn is currently following some lights flickering that lead him to Base, who refuses to come back because he needs to see the life in the water that started it all. Alvin insists and makes Base snap, grabbing Alvin and making him spout water through his mouth. Doolin arrives to warn them about an incoming wave caused by the boat changing course, so Base drops Alvin and runs away. Doolin drags Alan's body away from the water and Magnus comes to help with CPR, but it's too late. When Kat arrives, she confirms Alan somehow drowned. Rose continues to study the ash, and when she drops a bit of blood on it, she confirms there are living organisms in it. She goes to see Magnus, who informs her the vessel left to help another rig first. Rose brings him and Kat to her office to explain the ash is some kind of parasitic spore that is looking for hosts. And it repairs their wounds quickly because it wants a healthy body. They have to avoid long exposure to the ash and keep an eye on people with open wounds. Magnus authorizes Rose to take blood samples from the whole crew to compare them to what they have from base. In the mess hall, Heather notices the fog is finally going away and the neighboring rig has completely been destroyed. Former finds Baz looking at Rose's research and tries to offer help, but Baz refuses because the light needs him. Rose arrives to and sees Baz is taking his own blood sample. When she asks for his cooperation, he runs away. When Magnus hears about what happened, he sends Kat to check on everyone that has injuries since they can't do the testing anymore. After isolating former, Magnus calls for another meeting. Now the fog and ash are gone, he wants half the team to disinfect the rig thoroughly. The other half must find base. Rose continues investigating and discovers the spores have been seen before fossilized in layers of earth. They should have died with the dinosaurs, but drilling so deep has awoke in a sleeping nest. Outside, Base is throwing his blood sample into the sea. His body is fully healed now and he touches the tanks of water as a test, instantly filling them with spores. He hides when he hears James looking for him, but when James sees the sport water and calls for help, so Base has to shut him up. Lars and Dunland come to the room and find James wounded on the floor. Lars notices the spores in the water have started to grow plants. In the machinery room, Heather, Easter and Merge also find plants growing on the oil. Suddenly, the rig starts shaking again and Dunland realizes James is bleeding. When the boy opens his hand, he reveals he lost a tooth, meaning he's infected. Scared, James hits Dunland and runs away. The rig starts losing power again, so Magnus takes Former out of isolation to make him fix it. Heather sees Baz and follows him into the mud pit where Baz is growing plants all over the place. Baz explains 1 million-year-old memory has told him he needs to defend this place because it's being attacked. If it dies, everyone will go down with it. Suddenly, James shows up, too, because he's joined Basis, cause the rest of the team realizes Heather is gone, and Mars comes to rescue her, making Base and James run away. Before Heather can get more answers, Former manages to restore power, and the team discovers the flare on the production module is gone. They need to disconnect it from the electricity system to stop it from exploding, but the module control is in the mud pit where they could be infected by the spores. There are only options to reignite the flare manually and Former accepts to take the risk. Easter controls the crane to bring Former closer to the module, but it's not enough. Thus, Former eclipses harness and comes as close as possible for a proper shot. The flare is turned on again successfully, but Former's hit by the fire and has to be taken to the infirmary to take care of some serious burns on his back. In the mud pit bases, visions get worse, and he comes to the conclusion they need to shut down the rig system to stop the attack. James tries to close the valve, but the pipes are still pressured and they could blow up, so they're going to access the system from the source. Later, after a visit from Rose, Former swears he feels fine and gets dressed because he wants to help. Rose and Heather began working together on the research, and Former unconsciously draws some circles on a pad like Baz used to. Suddenly, Magnus calls them all to the control room where he's discovered the pressure is incredibly high, because Base is trying to bypass the safeties for the well. Former can't take control away from him remotely, so they will have to take a risk with the Bullseye Wrath. Easter guides the Wrath and gets underwater images showing that the earthquakes have created a series of circles on the land that remind Former of his drawings. The Wrath carefully approaches the wellhead and shuts it off, making Base furious because his plan has failed. He tries to access the system directly from the CPU, but it has an alarm on it, so they need Former to disable it. Suddenly, Easter's phone gets a message, and the crew discovers communications are back. Magnus tries to contact the Coast Wanda, and Former Google is the meaning behind circles that seem to be communicating something. Rose searches the company's system for some containers Heather found, and nobody knew about, only to discover a project called Siren that she can't access. She also finds Farmer's drawings. Kat calls her wife, who explains the company told the families the crew's fine and that they've also been having electrical problems. At that moment, the fog arrives in the city, and now people on land are the ones without power. Internet signal goes down and the guard doesn't get Magnus messages asking for help. Bass uses his spore's powers to connect with Foma's body, which begins healing more quickly. Former also begins hearing Boss's voice in his head, so he runs to the bathroom to look at his wounds. Rose sees he's missing and goes to check on him, startling Former because for a moment he sees Base in the mirror. He confesses everything to Rose, who kisses him to comfort him. This causes Former to have a vision of her suffering and Base's apparition asking him to join him. Hours later, Rose checks on Former again only to find a note he left behind. Rosa goes after him and Kat joins her together. They find Former going to the mud pit. The girls enter the pit too and the spores approach Kat but don't attack. Instead they circle her stomach because they're curious about the baby. Rose drags Kat out before it gets worse and they find the crew getting excited because there's a series of lights approaching the rig. It's a ship coming from the neighboring rig. The crew receives the survivors and Rose meets Koku, works for the company's research division, and demands to be taken to the control room immediately. Kat checks on the other men to make sure there aren't any injuries, and Easter surprised to see his old flame horse among them. Coke explains his rig exploded after a pressure failure and thinks they need to prioritize getting access back to the production module. Rose wants to know why Coke had been sent to the rig, but he refuses to explain in the infirmary. Horace tells Easter a different story. When Coke arrived at the rig, he sent a bunch of people home, and the rest had to help him install some new equipment. They weren't drawing oil up. They were sending something down. Then the fog came in and people started to disappear. But Coke stayed calm as if he had done this before. He kept pushing the equipment test and ignoring the pressure warnings until the rig exploded. Heather enters the system to cross-check the list of survivors with the crew files, but she can't find Coke's name. She tells Easter and Horace about this, and Horace explains Coke had been accessing the system with a temporary account. the IT guy made when he arrived. Before they left the rig, he wiped everything related to the test. Heather checks the system and Harish points at a strange name on the crew list that wasn't there before. There are emails telling the company that the organism has already spread, which means Coke's always known, and the company sent him on purpose. Kat checks on Rose and thinks the circle she's studying look like a tree, making Rose realize this may be how the spores keep track of time. The gap between the rings marks the 5 major mass extinction events, which means the last ring is the present and is closing up quickly to destroy them. Coke explains that's what happened in his rig. The explosion had been caused by the infected people opening the well to blow it up. He wants to send a team to the production module, but Magnus refuses to take that risk and Rose guesses all those containers in the testing are the secret Project Siren. Former finally joins Bass and James, but he notices his mind is clearer than his friends. Bass explains he hasn't been exposed to the spores long enough yet, but they'll take over soon. Bass can help him harness them. If Former accepts to deal with the system, Former begins to work, but it'll take a while to shut down the alarm. Dunlin, Lars and Merge call Coke for a private meeting because they're sick of Magnus' bad decisions and want to hear Coke's ideas. Coke explains they can stop Bass by using the carbon dioxide from the secret containers to knock him down. It's just a matter of entering the mud pit and connecting the carbon dioxide to the ventilation system. The trio gets the canisters from the containers in Dun and get suspicious because the label says the carbon dioxide is mixed with something else. They take the canisters to the mud pit and connect them to the ventilation shafts, protecting themselves with masks. Bass sends James and Former to check what's going on and James finds the trio first only to suddenly throw up blood on them. The guys realize the carbon dioxide isn't knocking James out. It's killing him in the plants because it was Coax's plan all along. Lars and Merge run away, but Dublin doesn't join them until he's sure James can't be saved. Former tries to shut off the ventilation, but both he and Bass pass out. In the control room, Kat finds Coke shutting down the doors around the mud pit after Lars and Merge escape, trapping Dumpling inside. Dunlen's mask runs out of oxygen, and he dies too. Heather and Horish tell Rose and Magnus about Coke and go to confront him, but Coke defends his actions as survival. Magnus opens the doors, but he can't get access to the ventilation pits. So Rose goes down there and takes a mask from Large to enter the mud pit. She shuts down the ventilation manually and then checks on Former who doesn't wake up when Rose shares the mask. However, when she accidentally touches the plants, the spores react and bring Former back to consciousness. They escape the pit together while Baz also wakes up and the last rain closes underwater. Magnus meets with Harish to hear the real story. Coke pushed the testing to the limit because he wanted to destroy the spore, losing. The rig was just collateral damage to survive. The vessel came to rescue them, but it crashed, so they wiped the system and got away on a small lifeboat, meaning they left people behind to die. Afterward, Magnus interrogates Coke, who explains this has all been company policy. They don't want to lose their precious oil reserves. They just want to keep drilling without interruptions. Thus Coke was sent to exterminate the spore. If they don't stop it, now, it will spread all over the world. In order to survive, they need to kill every infected person. Magnus discusses their options with Rose who thinks killing the infected ones won't do anything. So she'll work with Former to find an alternative. Perhaps Former can communicate with a sport like Bass doesn't explain they could cooperate instead of attacking each other. In the pit, Best senses the spores shutting him out and another earthquake hits the rig. Former uses a little plant to connect to Baz and sees the spores are trying to trigger the next great slide to wipe the ocean clean. Rose points out that the spore's a living network threaded throughout the seafloor all over the world, so attacking it here will barely hurt it. She thinks they should talk to Bass and make it stop the sport through his bond. Magnus would rather team up with Coke to stop it, but the others support Rose's theory and Magnus gives them permission to try. Magnus, Rose and Former end of the pit where Magnus keeps having visions of his dead son. They find Bears crying in a cloud of spore, saying it's too late and that he failed. Cope looks for Harish, explaining there are choppers already coming and that he'll bring Harish and his boyfriend if he helps him finish his mission. Paris suspects Coke wants to make the rig explode to cover it all up, and he secretly activates the microphones before making Coke admit everything for everyone to hear through the speakers. The earthquakes begin getting worse and the whole building begins breaking. Coke hits Harish to get him out of the way and start the explosion countdown. That's the moment when the choppers finally make contact with them. Coke runs away to the holodeck to escape alone, and Kat and Heather go after him while Easter helps her restart the imminent explosion. At the holodeck, Coke finds Lars waiting for him with the intention to kill him for revenge, but the girls arrive just in time to stop him. Paris shows up to announce he stopped the explosion, so now everyone needs to get ready to evacuate and Large punches Coke before joining the crew. In the pit, Rose notices the spore behaving differently, so she touches it. She manages to communicate with the spore, but before she can ask it to cooperate with humanity, the rig is hit by the worst earthquake yet and the guys drag her out. Bass decides to stay behind a proof to the sport that humans are capable of giving, too. Magnus, Rose and Former catch the last helicopter and they fly away right before its tsunami hits the rig, bringing it down. At the same time, Bass becomes one with the spore. Kat notices that tsunami will hit the beach and wants to warn the citizens, but the pilots push her away. As Coke explains, they aren't going home. At that moment that tsunami hits the city and kills Kat's wife, make sure to subscribe and turn on notification, so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.